Chapters 37 and 38 of Out of the Shadow by Rose Gollup Cohen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. Mother did not come out of the room that day. In the morning I was awakened by hearing her moaning. I lit the lamp and went in and looked at her. Her face was red and her chest rose and fell rapidly. For the first time this morning father looked really discouraged when he left the house. After the two older children went to school I tucked the little ones into one of the cots to play. Every day they remained in bed more willingly and played more quietly. I gave mother some water and milk and went in to ask our front neighbor what I could do for mother. She said she would see that a doctor came and made me understand that there were doctors who treated without a fee. And then she added, "As long as your mother is ill you need not fear that the landlord will put you out. It is against the law." I ran to mother with the good news. When I told her she looked at me as if she did not understand, so I explained. "It is a law in America that when you are sick—" Mother turned her face to the wall and gave an unpleasant chuckle which ended in a sob. The doctor came at 3:00 in the afternoon. I lit the lamp and showed him into the sick room. He stopped in the middle of it, looked about at the walls and the ceiling and shrugged his shoulders. After he examined mother he shrugged his shoulders again. Finally he wrote out a prescription, said crossly that he would come again the next day at 10:00 and went away. When father came home in the evening and I told him that the landlord could not put us out, he told me to use the money which the lodgers had just paid us for the medicine and bread and coal. Mother grew worse. All day I walked from the children's cot to her room, where a little lamp burned steadily now, and then back to the children's cot. I felt as though I were in a nightmare. I never remembered mother ill before. She was the strongest in our family. And now to see her lying so still with her eyes closed and not even moaning, filled me with terror. The doctor came every morning at 10:00. He did not tell me what her illness was, and I dared not ask. Every day he would sit down on the bed, make me hold the lamp so that the light fell on her face, and sit looking at her. And I watched his face and hers and tried to understand. Sometimes I saw mother trying to rouse herself from her stupor. She would give her head a shake as if she were trying to shake something off. I could hear her teeth close tightly and her chin seemed to square a little. Then she would open her eyes and I saw for a moment a steady, determined look. I had often seen her so when she had something to overcome. I understood that this was the fight in her. I remembered the same look when she was planning father's escape from the constable in Russia. And I recalled seeing it one snowy, stormy night when one of the children woke up choking with the croup and she could not get anyone to go for the doctor. The road lay through a thick wood and wolves had been seen there. So she wrapped herself in a shawl, tucked up her skirt, took a staff and started. At dawn she returned, struggling through the snow in front of the man, making a path for him. I noticed that the doctor always looked pleased when he caught this expression. Gradually I began to understand that he depended on the fighting spirit in her. And I too began to look for it. Beside the doctor, two other people came every day, the landlord and the young man, our lodger's friend. The landlord was a gentle, quiet, prosperous-looking old man with a white moustache. He wore fine black clothes, black gloves and a high silk hat. It was strange to see him among us. As long as we had some money to pay he came every week and inquired whether father was working. But now that we had nothing to give he came every day. He would knock gently on the door, come in on tiptoes and ask quietly and cheerfully, "And how is your mother this morning?" When I told him, the same, he would give a short nod and tiptoe out with his head bent a little lower. I used to look forward to his coming. He was the only person who came among us that did not show suffering. I used to wish he would stay a little and talk to me. The young man would come in, ask about mother, and then sit down on a chair near the window from where he could see the whole house, and sit watching me as I went from mother to the children and then back to her. Once Aunt Masha came. She was dressed in an old brown dress which in better days she had discarded. She stayed a little while, gave the children a thorough washing, and went away. I believe now that she must have come more than this once, but this time is the only one I can recall during this period. One day a well-dressed, strange young man came in. He made sure of our name at the door and then came and sat down at the window, opened a little book, and began to question me about my family, my father's name, his trade, how long he had been out of work, how much he had earned, how long mother had been ill, and so on. As I was answering his questions I was in agony of fear, wondering whether this had anything to do with the landlord, and whether after all we would be thrown out into the street. He stopped for a few minutes and I sat down on the cot, closer to the children. The young man continued. "Where does your doctor come from?" "From Essex Street Dispensary." "Do you need anything?" I stared at him. He looked up and asked over again, patiently. "Do you need anything?" Do we need anything? I could not believe I heard right. It seemed such a strange question, and I did not answer, and he repeated the question in Yiddish. I finally did understand, and I heard myself say, "No." Still thinking that I did not understand, he asked, "Do you need any clothes?" I shook my head. "Do you need any shoes?" He looked at mine. "No," I said. "Do you need any food?" "No." "Have you everything?" "Everything," I repeated, but I could not look at him. He wrote rapidly for a few minutes, and then he went away. I went in to mother and bent over her, thinking that perhaps I could tell her about it. The heat beat from her body and her eyes were closed. I touched her, and she opened them. And when I looked into them, I knew she would not understand. In the evening when father was home, our neighbor brought in $4. "A strange young man left it," she said. And the next day there was a half ton of coal. Friday came. Even now, as I look back, it seems to me that weeks had passed since mother fell ill. And yet it might have been only days. This morning she lay in deep unconsciousness and the doctor spent a longer time looking at her. After I got the children to play quietly in a corner, I began to prepare for the Sabbath. There was little to prepare as there was no cooking to do. I polished our candlesticks, which we had bought here, and scrubbed the floor in the large room and then began to wash up the floor in the sick room. The light of the tiny lamp hanging on the wall only seemed to increase the gloom. How I wished, as I crept about on my hands and knees, that mother would wake and see how industrious I was, how I was tormented for ever having hurt her. Late in the afternoon our lodger's friend came. When I looked at him I was shocked and I knew that he had been to the missionaries. He was dressed in new clothes from head to foot and his face was clean shaven. He stood still with his back against the door for a moment and his face reddened as I stood staring at him. He asked his usual question about mother and took his seat at the window. And, as if to try his first sermon, he began to upbraid me for my pale face and red eyes, saying that mother would get well much sooner if I were more cheerful. Also, I ought to cheer up for the sake of the children. A girl almost 14 years old ought to know better, and so on. I bought 2 candles for a cent. I had a cent for candles, for we could go without bread but not without consecrating candles. I cut them in half to make 4 and placed them into the candlesticks. When it grew dark I lit them, gave one to each of the children, and we all walked and stood beside mother's bed. It took us a long time to rouse her. We had to repeat again and again, "Mother, this is Friday night." At last she opened her eyes and looked at all our faces one after the other. And when she realized what we wanted her to do, she raised her hands, but instead of the usual prayers the words came, "God have pity on my children." At midnight I tumbled out of the cot thinking that I heard her calling. When father and I bent over her we saw that a change had taken place. Her face was paler and was wet with perspiration. "Medicine," she made out the word with her lips. Father gave it to her, and then she told us, in that voiceless way of the sick, that she dreamt her father who had been dead a long while came and brought her a bottle of medicine. Father's face lit up with joy. "Thank God," he said, "that was a good dream." When the doctor came the next day, and when he looked at mother, a smile lit up his cross face. Another doctor was with him. "Look at this," our doctor said, pointing to the ceiling and walls. "And she has pulled through in this room. God, she must have a constitution of iron." With his usual gruffness the doctor now ordered chicken soup, milk and wine for mother. And only now father went and told our neighbor openly of our difficulties. She advised him hesitatingly to go and apply at 8th Street. 8th Street was how we referred to the United Hebrew Charities. Monday morning, after eating some bread, father started for 8th Street. He returned in the evening, empty handed, and sick with humiliation. When he reached the building there was already a long line of people. He stood all day waiting for his turn. He was nowhere near the window when the place closed. Next morning he left at dawn. The day passed and it was dark when we heard his footsteps in the hall. When he opened the door we saw a pair of chicken feet sticking out of the bag. Father sat down at the table and wept like a child. CHAPTER XXXVIII. Now it was sister who was supporting the family. She ran errands for the women on the block and minded the babies. She was 11 years old and small for her age, but no one who looked at her face hesitated to trust her. Sometimes a mother would leave her children with her and go out to work. And sister would tidy up the house, dress and feed the children, and keep them out. Often when I ran out for something, I met her in the street, wrapped in a woman's coat and carrying one little one on her back while 2 or 3 others were at her side. Her freckled small nose looked pinched, but she would look up so bravely with her soft grey eyes as she stood slightly bent under her burden. And in the evening she would bring home a few nickels. One night she was taken to a wedding to take care of 2 children. The next day we two stood at the window and she was telling me all about it. That hour impressed itself on my memory. It was cold and raining, but there was a good fire in our stove. Father, as usual now, was out looking for work. The boy was in school. Mother, still a convalescent, was lying on a cot napping. The 2 little ones were playing quietly in a corner and we two were at the window. What she had seen would have seemed wonderful to her at any time. In her present half-fed state, and in the same worn little plaid dress in which she had come from Russia, she had been almost overcome by the sight of the splendours. Her eyes were big and in her voice there was still expression of awe as she described the immense hall, the lights, the bride in her white lace veil and train, the bridegroom with a white flower in his buttonhole. As the children in her care were only 2 and 4 years they soon grew tired of running up and down the slippery floor. So she had to go early to the little retiring room at the back of the hall. This room was almost dark. There was a little table and a couch. On the couch a few children were already sleeping, so she sat down on the floor opposite the door with one child in her lap, pillowed the other against her side, and sat and rocked them. She sat rocking them all through the night. The children weighed heavily against her. But sometimes, when she could raise her head a little, she watched the dancers passing the door. "The women looked so beautiful," she said, "in pink or blue or white silk. And their hair shone as they danced by. When the music was low I could hear them laughing, they looked so happy." She looked thoughtfully for a moment into the yard. The rain was splashing down on the red roofs of the toilets. From a line a few pieces of clothes were flapping. "I wonder," she said, "how it feels to be happy." Soon after this the agent came again and told mother that she had a place for me. This time mother had to let me go. I did not mind going. It was not only that we were in dire need, I wanted to know how it felt to be a servant, also how the rich people lived. There was no doubt in my mind that the family where I was going would be rich. How else could they keep a servant? I packed a few things into a newspaper and mother went with me to the door. She neither cried nor spoke, but when I looked at her I knew that she was suffering. We all felt as if I were going a great distance away. I kissed the children, and sister ran out and watched me from the stoop as I walked away with the agent. This family also lived on Clinton Street, near Broome. Their name was Corlove. Mrs. Corlove was a tall, angular woman with a yellowish complexion and sharp grey eyes. She engaged me for 2 months, and I was to receive $6 for the first month and 7 for the second. When the agent was gone she told me that the baby whom she was rocking was 2 weeks old, and that the floors were dirty because there had been a party the day before. Then she gave me an old skirt and told me where to find a pail and brush. There were 3 rooms. The kitchen and bedroom had windows looking into a courtyard, but it was as dark in there as in our windowless bedroom at home. And I had to scrub them by gaslight. When I was through, Mrs. Corlove looked under the bed and into the dark corners of the kitchen, and I saw that she was pleased. There were 6 people in the family. Besides Mr. and Mrs. Corlove and their 3 children, Mrs. Corlove's brother lived with them. I sat down to supper with them at the table. There was soup, meat, potatoes and a heaping plate full of bread. I felt almost overcome at the smell and abundance of the food. But I clasped my hands in my lap and waited for the others to begin. At the first mouthful, I remembered that there was nothing but bread at home, and I could not swallow. Directly after the dishes were put away, Mrs. Corlove gave me 2 old quilts and a pillow, and showed me how to make a bed of chairs in the kitchen. This room connected the bedroom and the front room, where a flaring gas light burned and the family sat up talking. I heard the clock strike 11 when they went to bed. This was Wednesday night. I fell asleep thinking that I would ask Mrs. Corlove for half of my wages the first thing in the morning and take it home so that mother could use some of it for the Sabbath. The next day I rose early and worked all day. I swept and dusted, polished the stove and the candlesticks. I washed some of the clothes and prepared the vegetables for supper. And all the time I kept thinking about the money, could not get up courage to ask. So I kept putting it off from minute to minute. Each new piece of work I began I told myself, "When I get through with this, I'll surely ask." So the day passed, and again it was after supper. I felt disgusted with myself. I realized that I was capable of putting it off forever. It occurred to me that I must do it suddenly without giving myself time to think. As this thought came I fairly ran into the kitchen where Mrs. Corlove was and asked her breathlessly, "Will you please give half of my wages in advance?" She looked at me hard and said she would talk it over with her husband. Soon I was called into the front room. I stood before them and they both looked at me. Mrs. Corlove said, "You may take the money to your people Saturday." My heart sank and I stood without being able to say a word. Then I heard Mr. Corlove ask, "Do you want it sooner?" His voice was kind. I nodded my head. He took a roll of bills from his pocket, counted off $6 and gave it to me. I crammed it into my hand and hastened into the kitchen where my little shawl hung on a nail. I wrapped it around my head and shoulders and ran out. I could have sung for joy as I went, half running, half walking. I held my hand with the money against my breast under the shawl. I had never had so much money in my possession. "What will mother buy?" I wondered. "Perhaps meat and a Sabbath loaf and candles." I could see them all sitting around the table covered with a white cloth and bright with the candlesticks and the lights, and I could hear father saying grace over the white loaf. I went into the house without knocking. Everything looked so strange to me, as though I had been away a long time. The lamp in the bracket burned dimly and was smoking a little and there seemed so little life. I could not help comparing this home with that other brightly lit cheerful home. The children came running to meet me at the door. I felt their loving arms about me, and mother, both frightened and glad, asked, "What is the matter? You are all out of breath." Then I opened my hand and showed them what I had. End of chapter 38. Chapters 39 and 40 of Out of the Shadow by Rose Gollup Cohen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. Living with the Corloves was a great change for me. At home I had been spared all the hard work for my health had continued to be poor. But now I was suddenly treated not only as if my strength were normal, but unlimited. I rose when the men rose to go to work, and as they had to come into the kitchen to wash at the sink, I would creep into the niche behind the stove to dress. On Monday morning as I crouched there, I listened for Mrs. Corlove's footsteps and the thud of the big bundle of clothes on the floor. When I heard it, I crept out quickly, whether completely dressed or not, and my work began. I carried up the coal from the cellar and made the fire. I lifted the boiler half filled with clothes. I washed and scrubbed all day long. When night came, I crept gladly in between the 2 soiled quilts on my chairs. And though the house was full of life, for the gas lights flared, the people talked and the children ran races from room to room, I slept. Tuesday and Wednesday I ironed. On Thursday I scaled the fish and plucked and cleaned the fowl. Soon my hands grew red and coarse, and I was no longer repelled at touching soiled or mushy things. I would run out to the store with my hands covered with flour or black with the scrubbing water, for Mrs. Corlove could never wait for me to wash them. On Thursday, while I was cleaning out the fowl, she called, "Run to the store quickly, and never mind your hands." As I was running down the stoop steps I thought I caught sight for a moment of my mother's face. It looked so pale in the light of the street lamp. I had been thinking of her and in my present haste and usual absent mindedness I thought that I was still seeing her in imagination and did not stop to look but ran across to the grocer's. But a few minutes later as I was coming back, I was more alive to things, and the thought of that moment took more concrete form. I thought that I must have really seen her and that it would be just like my mother to come and stand there hoping to see me. I ran to the shadowy spot near the street lamp, but no one was there. The next moment I caught her hiding in the hall of the next building. Mother managed it so that I should see some one or other from home often. Usually it was my sister and brother. They would knock timidly on the door and come in holding each other tightly by the hand and remain standing near the door. I felt timid and humble myself in this house. But to see them hurt me so that I often wished mother did not send them. Mrs. Corlove would usually call to them, "Come, sit down, children." Then she would pick out an apple from the glass bowl, which usually stood on the table, cut it into 4 parts, give us each a quarter, and put the 4th quarter back. Little by little I began to know Mrs. Corlove and the rest of the family too. I thought her an excellent housewife, but exacting and in other ways too not over generous to me. She always doled out the food on my plate. It was usually the tail of the fish, the feet and the gizzard of the chicken, the bun to which some mishap had occurred. And she would look through the whole bowl of apples to find for me a spotted one. She rarely failed to remark at meals, "What an enormous appetite you have!" She always said it with a smile of surprise, as if she were merely interested. So she covered every act with a coating of kindness. Sunday was wash day, so she would send me to bed early on Saturday night and without supper. For that night no regular meal was prepared because we had a good dinner. The first 2 or 3 times she exclaimed, "Surely you cannot be hungry after such a meal?" After that she did not need to say it. I used to lie awake and try to make believe there was no food in the house. I had never found making believe so hard as in those days, for all the time I kept seeing the sweetened bread in the bread box. Late that night I would see the family sit down to tea and cake. It was hard to see sweetmeats and food about and not take them. Perhaps, if I had had enough even of coarse food, the temptation would not have been so great. But I could never eat enough even of bread with Mrs. Corlove's eyes watching me. And if you were only 14, and perhaps even if you were older, you too would be likely to begin thinking of a way to take it. You would say, perhaps, "After all, she never told me not to take it." And if you did remember her forbidding eyes, you would say to yourself, "Perhaps I only imagined it." At any rate that was the way I reasoned one day when Mrs. Corlove went to the butcher and there was a cold cracker dust pancake in the pan on the stove. For weeks I had watched Mrs. Corlove bake these pancakes. I had often had to carry plateful after plateful to some one or other in the family, and I could see the steam rising from them and the tiny drops of hot butter breaking up like bubbles. At these moments the desire to taste them was so strong that it was a pain. And this time there was one such cake left over as if to tempt me. It was morning. I went about sweeping and dusting and all the time I could see the cake on the pan. Finally I went to the stove and stood looking at the cake and tried to imagine how it would taste cold. My mouth watered and I could think of nothing else. Then, as if of its own accord, I saw my hand go out and take it. No sooner was the act done than I felt like Eve, perhaps after she ate the apple. I took the 2 steps into the dark corner near the stove and pressed my face against the wall. Mrs. Corlove missed the pancake immediately on her return. She said nothing, but she gave me a look and a smile that hurt more than blows could have done. Mrs. Corlove's brother was a big ill-natured fellow. His sister put up with all his whims and she seemed fond and proud of him. I used to hear her boasting to her friends that he was musical. He was a machine operator and when he was not working he would sit for hours in the rocker in the front room playing "After the Ball is Over" on the accordion. Mr. Corlove was quite different from his family. He was gentle and kind to everybody. When he was in the house I did not feel so timid and liked to come out of the dark kitchen into the front room. He was a foreman in a large clothing shop, and when he found that I knew of the shop, he spoke to me as to a fellow worker of the same trade. He often took my part against his brother-in-law, who enjoyed making me get up from the table and wait on him. He even defended me against his wife. I had learned during the first days that being Mrs. Corlove's servant meant that I was everybody's servant. When Mrs. Corlove's relatives came to the house they ordered me about as freely as Mrs. Corlove herself. But I never gave this a thought. This was her home and they were her guests. One day a sister in law of hers was moving. A few days before, Mrs. Corlove told me to take the pail and brush and go scrub the floors in the new rooms. I seldom fully realized things until they had happened and were past. And now, too, not until I was in the empty rooms and saw the filthy, hard-trodden floors, did I fully perceive the injustice of Mrs. Corlove's order. Then I sat down on the floor and cried passionately. I cried not only for this, but for many other things which I could not understand or understood but vaguely. I cried until I was again patient and meek. Then I went on my knees, scrubbed the floors, and went home. The gas was already lit in the kitchen and Mrs. Corlove was preparing supper. She looked at my face with surprise when I came in, but said nothing. I went about helping with the supper and keeping out of sight as much as I could. But Mr. Corlove had not been in the house 2 minutes when he asked his wife, "What is the matter with her?" "Oh, nothing," she said lightly. "Fanny, you know, is going to move to morrow." "Well?" "So I sent her to scrub her floors." He stopped in the middle of the kitchen and looked at her as if he did not understand. "Do you mean to say," he asked, drawing out his words, "that you sent her to scrub Fanny's floors?" "Oh, 3 little floors." I never imagined that a man so quiet and gentle could look so angry. His dark eyes flashed fire and he said hard things. Late that night from my chairs I heard them talking this thing over, as I had often heard them talk other things over. "Everyone's comfort is more to you than mine," she sobbed. "You know it is not so." His voice was very tender. "You don't seem to realize how unjust it was to the girl. You hired her to do your work, not Fanny's, and she is still but a child. Supposing it was our little Tink." His voice dropped so low that I barely caught the words. "Who knows?" he said. "To day it is this man's daughter. To morrow it might be ours." In the silence that followed I heard the little girl's crib moved, and I knew that the mother moved it closer to her bed. Near the end of my 2nd month I remember a beautiful day in March. Mrs. Corlove rarely left the house, but on this bright warm day she took all the children and went out, and I was left there for the first time quite alone. It was Wednesday afternoon, and I was sitting at the window making barley noodles. It seemed so quiet after the hustle and bustle of preparation to go out. I chopped and listened to the rhythmical sound of my 2 knives, and watched the streak of sunlight on the window sill which came slanting in between the 2 tenements. Gradually I began chopping more and more slowly. Finally I laid down the knives and rested my hands on the edge of the bowl. I saw that my hands were coarse and red, and here and there where the skin was cracked they were raw. I remembered how I had wanted to know how it felt to be a servant, and I laughed at myself. "I should not like to be a servant all the time," I thought. I looked out of the window and gradually I began to reason it out. I realized that though in the shop too I had been driven, at least there I had not been alone. I had been a worker among other workers who looked upon me as an equal and a companion. The only inequality I had ever felt was that of age. The evening was mine and I was at home with my own people. Often I could forget the shop altogether for a time, while as a servant my home was a few hard chairs and 2 soiled quilts. My every hour was sold, night and day. I had to be constantly in the presence of people who looked down upon me as an inferior. I felt, though in a child's way, that, being constantly with people who looked upon me as an inferior, I was, or soon would be an inferior. I was looked upon as dull, nothing was expected from me, and I would have nothing to give. The pancake incident had made a deep impression and had been tormenting me. I understood that under these conditions and in this atmosphere what had happened once was bound to happen again. Little by little I would become used to it and not mind it. My whole being shrank from this and similar things to which it might lead. I realized that I could not boast many qualities, but to what I had, even if it were only not to be sly, I clung with all my strength. "No," I concluded, taking up the knives and beginning to chop quickly to make up for the time lost. "I would rather work in a shop." CHAPTER XL. A few days later I left the Corloves. My belongings were wrapped in a newspaper and tucked under my arm, and I had $7 in my hand. I stopped on the stoop. The sun shone and the April breeze felt like a caress. It seemed strange not to have to hurry. Only now did I realize how tired I was. I felt my hands burn and my whole body tremble a little. I stood looking about, feeling both joy and regret. For I left the Corloves not with indifference. I had grown fond of the children, and even Mrs. Corlove herself, as I grew to know and understand her, I did not dislike her. But what a joy it was to know that I was free! Father would find work for me at once, for there was now a sprinkling of work over the city and he himself was working at last. But this day at any rate was before me. How I loved the sun! I walked home slowly, basking in it. Before many days passed I was working in a shop on Canal Street. Father had not yet been working a full week. But after the hardship we had suffered, $8 every week seemed a fortune. Mother began paying off what we owed the landlord, and she even managed to save a few cents every week for a piece of material to make up a little dress for whichever one of us needed it most. The children were going to school and things were running smoothly. But it was not for long. Soon again mother went about her work looking worried and perplexed, and we children were again aware of the darkness in the bedroom and that the sun never came into the big room. "Perhaps," mother sighed, "a human being must not have it comfortable long or he would forget God." This was the trouble. With the coming of the warm days my health became so poor that I had to stay away from work quite often. Mother was the more alarmed because she could not understand what was wrong. There seemed nothing wrong. But the slightest exertion made my temples throb and my head go around. The shop where I was working now was on the top floor. I would stand long and look up the stairs before beginning to climb. It seemed like a dream that I ever ran up and down stairs for pure amusement. Then came a morning when I could not get up at all. I stayed in bed 2 days and mother made inquiries and found that Governor Street Dispensary was not far away, and quite free. So on the third morning, which was Monday, she helped me dress and we started. Many times on the way we had to stop to rest on doorsteps. At last we came to a small ground floor building near Governor Street dock. A policeman stood at the door and a few people were in line. We took our places and the policeman told us the door would open at 9 o'clock. I stepped a little out of the line to lean against the wall. The sun was beating down strongly on our heads, but from the water a refreshing breeze came up and we could hear the boats, while from a reddish smoke covered building came the cry of geese. Mother, too, was looking around. She was easily interested in everything about her. She remarked now, "That must be a slaughterhouse." And then, partly perhaps to take my attention away from myself, she motioned sadly to the line. This was our first experience with a dispensary. There were 3 people in the line ahead of us. Next to me was a man with his arm in a sling who looked like an Irish dock laborer. Next to him another, with sawdust clinging to his clothes, wavered unsteadily. The first was a woman whose home I knew was the dark hallway and the park bench. As we were going in the policeman handed us each a red cardboard ticket with a black number on it. I saw the woman, as she passed him, raise her chin and steady her step. We all sat down on the first bench. I leaned against my mother, closed my eyes, and sat waiting for my turn. This doctor, like the first I had seen, raised my eyelids and asked how long I had been so pale. He advised mother to feed me up and keep me outdoors. I translated what he said and mother asked timidly, "Ask him what is the matter." He understood and answered in German, "Anemia." And now I became mother's first care. She saved on food that the others needed and bought milk and meat for me, and that I might be able to eat it in peace she would take the children out of the house. Often the little girl would refuse to go out. She would raise herself on tiptoe to look into my plate and lisp wistfully, "I wish I were sick." In a few weeks I was strong enough to go to the shop again. But what took weeks to build up I lost in a few days, and soon again I was staying home, this time going to the dispensary regularly. As I stood there in line or sat on the bench in the waiting room, waiting for my turn, I grew to know many of the people who, like myself, came often, and to be familiar with every nook and corner in the room. I came every week, and one week was exactly like another. There was the same room, many of the same people, and each time the same thing happened. First, on coming into the waiting room, we would all sit down heavily. After this it became very still in the room. I would close my eyes for a moment with a feeling of relief at having my feet off the floor. Then, rested a moment, I would look about at the others. I knew at once from their faces, and even from their unconscious backs, I could gather who was better, who was worse, and who was the same. Then I would look about the room. There was the same unpainted, cleanly scrubbed floor, the shining brass knobs of the 2 doors on the right, and the one on the left, and the tiny staircase leading up. Then again I would study the men and women, more slowly this time, and aware now of every sound and motion, a hand unsteadily raised to the forehead, a half-suppressed cough sounding loud in the stillness, a patient sigh, a feverish look. Next, as the time of waiting lengthened, I became aware of the air in the room, the hot breath of sick people mixed with the odor of medicines, the breath of tobacco and stale whiskey. At this period of waiting I lost my interest in everything. My spirit had sunk with a heavy depression. Of the rest of the people some dozed heavily, some moved about restlessly in their seats, and others, like myself, were given over to dull apathy. Then one of the doors on the right would open quickly and cause a stir on the benches, and a wave of new life passed through the room. I loved to watch the patients coming out of the doctor's office. Every face looked brighter, more hopeful. End of chapter 40. Chapters 41 through 43 of Out of the Shadow by Rose Gollup Cohen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. When we finished paying what we owed the landlord, our lodgers moved away, and we moved again into 3 rooms on the same block, but nearer to Clinton Street. We were glad to find rooms so near, for we could save the moving expenses. Late one night, when father came home from work, he and mother carted over the furniture on a pushcart, the children carried the clothes and pots and pans in their arms, and I stayed in the new rooms and put things in their places as they came in. We liked moving from one place to another. Everyone on Cherry, Monroe and other streets moved often. It meant some hard work, but we did not mind that because it meant change in scenery and surroundings. None of the places were pretty and most of them were dingy. But moving even from one dingy place to another is a change. And then, too, some were less dingy than others. Here, for instance, the living room, instead of being painted an ugly green that had made everything look dark, and that had depressed our spirits, was a bright pink. Also, there were 2 windows facing the street through which the sun came in. And if there was less privacy, for the rooms were on the stoop, just a few steps above the sidewalk, it was pleasant to sit down near the window and watch the people passing by. Across the street there was a blacksmith's shop. I liked to listen to the ding, ding of the hammers beating in unison, and we could see the sparks flying. Sometimes a bright, healthy young face, all covered with grime, was pressed against the heavy grating of the blacksmith's shop window. One day the young man saw me looking over and he grinned. Cherry Street is not a wide street, and he probably saw my embarrassment, for he threw his head back and laughed heartily. All these things were important when I was 15 years old and we lived on Cherry Street. The first neighbor with whom we became acquainted in this house was the dressmaker, who lived across the hall. Her husband was a carpenter. Whenever he was not working, I would see him sitting at the window reading a book. One day when I went in to see the raisins, I found that the husband was out and the book was lying on the table. I had long been curious about it, and now I took it up and sat down at the window. Of course it was in Yiddish. I began to spell out the words. I had not read since I came to this country and had almost forgotten how. But as I read line after line it became easier and easier, and soon I forgot all about everything, and did not hear Mrs. Raisin working at the machine, her 3 little ones romping about the room, the clattering of the heavy trucks passing the window, and the ding-ding from the blacksmith's shop. I became aware of these things again only when I heard Mrs. Raisin saying, "Girl, you are blinding your eyes." Then I looked up and saw that night had come. I found from Mr. Raisin that these books could be borrowed from soda-water stand-keepers, if one left 15 cents security and paid 5 cents for the reading of the book. I listened to all the details with discouragement. For when could I hope to have 20 cents saved? Nevertheless, I began to save, or rather, I determined to put away the very first cent I had. But in the meanwhile I watched out for Mr. Raisin's book. He rarely forgot to put it out of sight, for he had 3 mischievous little children. But whenever I saw it on the table I would go in and read it. At last one night I brought home my first volume. I took the lamp out of the bracket, placed it on the table, and opened the book. I had told the stand keeper to give me anything as long as it was with vowels. For I had only learned to read the Hebrew print that had the vowels. These consisted in dots and lines printed under each letter. In the meantime the children gathered around me and mother came over with her sewing and looked at me disapprovingly, sadly. "What a child you are!" her eyes seemed to say. "How little sense you have! If you had spent this money on nourishing food." And again, "True, you did not ask for the money, you saved it. But where did it come from?" I understood this as plainly as if she had uttered the words. Poor mother, she was often worried over how to live and save on our $6 or $7 and over my health. And so, partly with the hope of cheering her up a little and partly to draw her attention away from myself and a possible scolding, I began to read aloud. In a few minutes I looked up and saw her stitching quickly on the little dress she was mending. I could see she was listening, but the sad look had not left her eyes. But when again I looked up, the little dress lay forgotten in her lap, and on her face there was a healthy look of interest and curiosity. The only stories she had ever heard before were from the Bible. From that time many happy evenings were ours. Mother always listened reluctantly, as if she felt it were a weakness to be so interested. Sometimes she would rise suddenly during the most interesting part and go away into the dark kitchen. But soon I would catch her listening from the doorway. And I live now in a wonderful world. One time I was a beautiful countess living unhappily in a palace, another time I was a beggar's daughter singing in the street. Of course, we never drew more than one little book a week, about 250 pages for 5 cents, but I got all I could out of it. I read it aloud, I reread it to myself, and I lived it when I was not reading. Almost every book had a song or a poem. These I learned by heart, found appropriate melodies for them out of the great stock of Russian peasant songs that I knew, and when Aunt Masha and her friends came on a Saturday I would sing to them. Mother always seemed uneasy when she heard these songs, and sister would look at me with astonishment and her truthful eyes seemed to say, "How can you?" I did feel guilty, but the next time they came I had a new song for them. One day when I went to change my book the stand keeper looked over his 3 shelves of books, high over his stand, and said finally, "I don't believe I have another book with vowels." No more books! I pictured an impossible existence in our house without the joy of reading. "Look well," I begged him. He stood up on a high stool and began rummaging about on the top shelf. "Here," he said, "is the last one, and I don't think you will like it. It is a thick, clumsy volume." A thick volume! Could a book be too thick? And what did the clumsiness matter? "Let me see it," I said, controlling my eagerness; for I had learned that people were often charged according to the desire they showed for the article. I turned to the first page of the story and read the heading of the chapter, "I am born." Something in these 3 little words appealed to me more than anything I had yet read. I could not have told why, but perhaps it was the simplicity and the intimate tone of the first person. I had not read anything written in the first person. My eager fingers turned to the title page and I uttered the words half aloud, "David Copperfield, by Charles Dickens." "I'll take it," I said. I laid the 5 pennies on the zinc covered soda counter and walked away slowly, expecting and fearing to hear the stand keeper's voice calling after me and demanding an extra 5 cents because the book was so thick. But when the danger of that was past I fairly ran home with my prize. What a happy 2 weeks we spent! We lived little David's life over with him. Mother cried when he and Peggotty bade each other farewell through the keyhole, and then she laughed at her tears, remembering that it was "only a story." And as I sat in the shop, felling sleeve lining, I would go over in my mind what I had read the night before. With what joy I looked forward to the evening when after supper we would all gather around the lamp on the table and sister or I would read aloud, while mother sewed and the little ones sat with their chins very near the table. For if there was any joy to be gotten out of anything they must have their share. And so they would sit blinking sleepily and trying hard to understand, but finally they would fall asleep with their heads on the table. Then mother, sister and I would move closer to each other and I would read in a lower voice. When we were through with David Copperfield we felt as if we had parted from a dear friend. We could not bear to read anything else for a whole week. The next book we drew was without vowels. Sister and I had never dreamed it would be so easy to learn to read it. In a week we read it as fluently as the other. And now reading material was not so limited. A flying newspaper in the street, a crumpled advertisement sheet, I would smooth out tenderly and carry off home, happy in the expectation of what was awaiting me. I tried to understand everything I read, but if I could not, I read it anyway. For just to read became a necessity and a joy. There were so few joys. CHAPTER XLII. One night about this time when I came into the house I was shocked at what I saw. Father was sitting on a low box in the middle of the room. He was in his stocking feet, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bent between his hands. Sister stood near the lamp in the bracket reading a letter and crying bitterly. My thought was of grandmother at once. I went over to sister and looked over her shoulder. After a lengthy and ceremonious greeting it read: "Your mother is dead. But you should not grieve, you should be glad, for she suffered much in these 2 years." It was an old woman that wrote the letter, and what she told of grandmother's suffering is too horrible to repeat. The letter closed with: "I only hope and pray that he who breaks every home, he to whom no bond is sacred, the Czar of Russia, may know at least for 1 year in his life the sorrow and loneliness she has known." It was also about this time that a man came from our part of the country and gave us news of grandfather. He was in Minsk in a home for the aged. The man had seen him and said that he was well but at times his mind was like that of a child. He spoke of his children in America and his eyes were full of tears. But soon he chuckled gleefully. "Brother," he said to the man, "come, I will show you something." He took him by the hand and led him to a cot standing in a corner. He looked around cautiously like a shy little squirrel and then took a tiny bundle in a red bandana from under the pillow. He patted the little bundle and smiled brightly at the man. "You see, brother," he whispered, "as long as I have this, I have no fear of want." He untied the knot with his poor old trembling fingers, and the man saw a few little lumps of sugar and a few crusts of bread covered with green mold. All his life the thought of want in his old age had been his one fear. CHAPTER XLIII. The warm days passed, but my health did not improve. On the contrary, it grew worse, and I worked less and less, a day in one shop, a half day in another, for I had no steady place now. Often after I had worked a morning in a shop the boss would pay me for the half day, and tell me he had no more work. I understood that I was not doing enough and it did not pay him to keep me. When I had the strength and the courage I would go to other shops and ask if they needed a feller hand. It did require courage to enter a shop for the people stared, my face was so pale. When I did not have the courage I went home and was glad to lie quite still on the couch. In the autumn I had to stay at home altogether. What little I had earned was badly missed. Winter was coming and none of us had even half warm enough clothing. So father decided that sister should leave school and take my place. She had just learned to read and write a little, and of course she could speak English. It was thought that she had made good progress in the short time, considering the drawback she had had in not knowing the language. We all felt sad, mother particularly, that her education should end here. Sister herself took it in a way characteristic of her. Her days in school had been happy ones. She had been known and loved by teacher and pupils throughout the little Henry Street school. And like the rest of us she did not look upon "free schooling in America" in a matter-of-fact way. She, a little Jewish girl from an out-of-the-way Russian village, of which no one ever heard, was receiving an education. It seemed a wonderful privilege. But when she saw that this was not to be after all, she did not utter a single word of protest or complaint. On the first morning of going to the shop, for she was starting in as a finisher on buttonholes, she rose very early, as I had once done. I lay on the couch in the front room, which was my place now, and watched her. This morning reminded me of that first one when I left for the strange shop. Sister was about the same age. There were the same preparations, the same grey light in the room. The only difference was that now Mother was here to put the thimble and scissors into her little coat pocket and tuck the little bundle of lunch under her arm and close the door after her, and then stand so still with her face pressed against it. I stayed in the house all day. I felt despondent. I often felt in the way. When night came or it was time for Father to be home from work, I went out. I had begun to feel in the way when Father was in the house. As the illness or semi-illness continued Mother became even more tender and devoted. But Father's sympathy waned. This illness was such a long drawn out affair. It had had no definite beginning and promised to have no end. And besides, he saw that I suffered no pain, I was merely pale and not over strong. What of that? He himself was not strong. He found sitting in the shop harder and harder as the years were passing. He had been working as a tailor since he had been 12 years old. And just now his eyes were troubling him. For he had inherited Grandmother's weak eyes. And so he felt, no doubt, that just when I should have been a greater help to him, I became a care and expense. Besides this, there were other unpleasant features. For people in my parents' circumstances it was not a usual thing to keep a daughter at home. And so inquisitive relatives and neighbours began to ask why. Why was I staying at home? What was the matter with me? Why was I so pale? My parents felt they must hide the truth even at the cost of lying, for I was growing up, and what man would marry a sick girl? But it must not be thought that now we lived only in trouble. We had our joys, too. They seem very trivial, but they helped to make up our life. Father belonged to a society in which he was an active member. The men often came to our house to talk things over with him, and he felt important and often offered our front room for committee meetings. Before they opened the meeting they always assured Mother that they would not keep us up any later than 10 o'clock. But when the time came they were so deep in discussion that they never even heard the clock strike the hour. I used to sit down in the doorway of the kitchen and front room from where I could see all their faces, and listen to their heated arguments. Always it was a piece of burial ground that was the subject of discussion, and when a member, or any one belonging to his family, died, whether the rest of the members should contribute an extra $1 to cover burial expenses, and whether as a society they should or should not employ a doctor and pay him out of the society fund. At 12 o'clock or even later, they would at last break up, with the question of the burial ground and the extra $1 and the doctor still unsettled. Then Mother and I would go into the front room, coughing and choking from the cigarette smoke, and open up the folding cots and carry the sleeping children to bed. The 2 little ones often cried at being awakened to undress. But Father, if he had succeeded in carrying a point, and in the knowledge that he had served the society in giving the room, went to bed smiling. Sister was happy in a friendship she had formed. The little girl was the oldest in a family of boys. The mother was always sick. And this little woman of 11 went to school, where we heard she was remarkably bright. And between times she took care of the mother and the boys and the house. She went patiently, with her back a little bent, from task to task, and was always sweet and bright. Sister made friends with her one Friday night when she sat with her little brothers on the iron steps of the tenement, telling them stories. And my mother, after visiting the sick woman, would often tell herself and us too, "Children, we must not sin. Indeed, we have a great deal for which to be grateful." While I, having more time now, dreamed more, I rarely had a book to read, now that I was not working. But as I lay on the couch with my eyes closed, I made up stories for myself. They were of the life I saw about me, with little variations to suit myself. Some of the stories were short, some were long, and I continued them from day to day. Once or twice I tried to write the things. But the moment I had the pencil in my hand my mind became a blank. I did not know where to begin, what to say. And when I finally succeeded in writing a few sentences, it seemed to have no meaning. And yet, I wondered, in my mind a few minutes before, they did have a meaning. Often, too, I thought over religious questions that I heard or which came up in my mind. I was still religious, but I could no longer accept my religion without question. And these questions perplexed me, and I felt guilty that they should come up at all and tried to put them away from my mind. Now, also that I had time, I began to go to night school, and sister came too. I only knew how to read a word here and there. I sat in the class and followed each girl that read with my finger on the page. If I happened to lift my finger, I could not find the place. Sister would have sat near me and helped me, but I felt ashamed to let her help, because I was the longest in this country. She read well and made good progress. But I sat trembling with nervousness all evening. I could never learn to forget that there were people all about me. And the time I spent in waiting for the teacher to call on me to read, I can only count among the greatest sufferings I ever had. I would sit with my hands lying cold in my lap and my face turning hot and cold by turns. Most of the time I was unable to follow, I was so upset. And when the teacher called on me at last and I stood up with my book in my hand, I seemed to see nothing but a blank page. Then I would hear a queer sound, like of some one sick. The next moment I was sitting down. And yet I could not bear to stay away. I had a feeling that the world was going on and I was being left behind. This feeling drove me on, and I went to the class and learned painfully, a word or two at a time. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Out of the Shadow by Rose Gollup Cohen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44. One day when I was 16 years old, a neighbor came into our house. She glanced at me on the couch and at my mother sewing at the window. "What?" she said. "Is your daughter still ill?" Mother bent her head lower over her work, but answered lightly, "Yes, but it is nothing." "You know," the neighbor smiled after a few moments, "I think I know of a remedy." Mother looked up for the first time. "Yes?" she asked. "Yes." The neighbor smiled again. She would not say what it was, and went out with a mysterious nod and smile for each of us. In the evening after supper 2 days later, while I was preparing to go out for a walk, Mother said she had no sugar for the morning. She laid the money on the table and said with unusual quietness, "Sugar is 15 cents a paper nearly everywhere, but there is one store where you can get it for 14. "Where?" I asked. I was at the mirror combing out my hair and stood with my back toward the room. "It is on Broome Street near the market." I turned quickly, but Mother was already walking into the kitchen. I thought it very queer, but did not say anything. I braided my hair, put on my hat and coat, and ran out. I began to run at once, for I was always afraid of the cold. As I ran, I thought again of my errand, and wondered at it. True, we never stopped at any distance to get a thing a cent cheaper, but to go as far as this for a paper of sugar seemed extreme even for us. And Mother's manner surprised me even more as I recalled it now. When I reached Broome Street I looked up at the numbers and found that I still had a distance to go. I walked leisurely now, for I was no longer cold. An agreeably warm sensation was tingling through my whole body and the air seemed sweet. I was also conscious of a vague happiness, and wondered. There seemed so little cause. 1 hour before I had been so miserable. The cause seemed that father was irritable, Mother sorrowful, and the light in the room was dim, and I knew that the next day would be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. I found the grocery, a one-store window. A bell tinkled over the door as I entered. No one was in, so I went and leaned on the wooden counter to wait. Presently, a fair young man with a ruddy face and stooping shoulders came in from a door at the back. He asked mechanically what I wanted and pushed the paper of sugar across the counter with scarcely a glance at me. I saw a corner of a lump of sugar sticking out through the bag, so I asked, "Will you please put this into another bag? I have quite a distance to go." He looked up quickly and stared at me for a moment. Then he took a bag and began slipping the sugar into it. The bag broke, so he crumpled it up, threw it under the counter and took another one. "Where do you live?" he asked, working with marked slowness and tearing this bag too. "On Cherry Street," I said. He was silent, but I noticed that his face looked more animated than it had been. At last my sugar was safe in 2 bags, and he handed it to me instead of pushing it across the counter as before. "How is it out?" he asked, glancing at me shyly for the second time and then looking toward the door. With people that were shy I felt at ease, almost bold. So I answered pleasantly, "Fine. It is cold, but there is no wind." And now, since I had spoken to him, I thought it would be rude not to say good night. As I was walking toward the door, I was aware that he stood still looking after me. It was only later, when I recalled these details, that I realized I had noticed them. Again, about 2 days later, my mother asked me hesitatingly and without looking at me, "Well, what do you think of that young man?" I looked at her in surprise. "What young man?" I asked. "The young man from the grocery store on Broome Street," she said. "I did not think of him. Why?" Then, with great earnestness, mother explained to me that the young man was a possible suitor and a very desirable one, that he was getting an excellent living out of the store and that he very much wished to become "further acquainted," and a meeting had already been arranged for Saturday. I was bewildered by what had been happening. I was grown up. A young man was coming to see me. I would soon be married, perhaps. The thought, "I am grown up," came again and again. It seemed incredible. I remember late one night, perhaps it was that very first night, when it was still all through the house, I rose from the couch, took the tiny night lamp from the nail and tiptoed to the half length mirror hanging between the two windows. I held it up and looked at myself earnestly for a long minute. "So I am grown up," I thought. During the few days that followed there was a great hustle and bustle in our house. Our first furniture had long ago been broken up, and a second hand couch for $2 that had been added since, now stood on 3 legs. So mother brought forth the homespun linen sheet, which she had as a relic from home, and spread it over the couch. "When will there be a better time to use it than now?" she said, and smiled at me. And father went out and bought 2 straight back chairs and a rocker, and we were ready to receive the young man. He came Saturday about 3 o'clock, accompanied by a middle aged man, who introduced himself as "the oldest uncle." I shrank behind my mother and a cousin who had been invited to be present to give her opinion of the young man. At last the first few minutes, the worst part, was over. We were all seated. Father and the uncle sat at the table opposite each other and at once began a lively conversation to which the rest of us sat and listened respectfully. When I felt more at ease I observed the young man. I felt as if I'd known him a long time. It seemed quite natural that he should sit with his neck shrunk into his collar and keep his hat on like the 2 older men and be quite as old fashioned as they were. Then in my mind arose the image of another young man. He was the imaginary companion of my childhood grown older. He was tall and dark and not at all shy. I sat thinking so until I noticed the uncle observing me from time to time and I became uneasy again. But I too observed him. I liked him. He reminded me of Mr. Peggotty from David Copperfield. He was a large, strong, ruddy faced man with a hearty, frank manner. He was leaning on the table, with his hands clasped in front of him, and he looked right into my father's face as he talked. He was relating his experiences as a newsdealer. At last he sat back in his chair. My heart began to beat uncomfortably. "Now," he said, "supposing we talk of things nearer our hearts." I was aware that even the children avoided looking at me. "Tell me," the uncle asked in his frank, blunt way, glancing at me and then looking at my father, "why do you want to marry off that girl? She is so young and not at all homely. What is the haste?" There was a tone of suspicion in his voice as if he feared a bad bargain. There was a buzzing in my ears and I wanted to run away. Indistinctly I heard my parents answer something and at the same time I suddenly saw the young man standing before me and asking, "Will you come for a walk with me?" I rose quickly, went into the bedroom and stood with my face pressed against the clothes hanging on the wall. Then I came out dressed in my childish hat and coat and we went out. And now I heard him talk for the first time since I bought the sugar in his store. His tone was earnest and a little eager, his expressions (we spoke Yiddish, of course) were almost biblically old fashioned, as if he had just come from some pious Russian village, instead of having been in America 5 years. He told me that he had 3 uncles. I recall these words spoken confidently but piously. "My uncles are all espoused and with the help of God they are making a living." I gathered that he wanted me to know that as a member of this family he too felt confident of being able to make a living. He talked the whole while to the same effect. His tone became more eager and persuasive. From this and his looks and manner his thought of myself was very clear to me. I felt a little pleased, but that was all. When we came home we had cake and tea and then they went away. That evening and the next day my parents looked quietly excited and expectant. The next night, while we were at supper, a message came from the matchmaker saying that the young man and his family were "pleased" and would be happy at an alliance. Father was so pleased at the news that his face became quite radiant. He sat back in his chair and laughed joyously. It appeared that he had not expected it. "A girl without a cent to her name," he said, quite lost in wonder. Mother too looked pleased, but she was not so humble. "Not every girl needs a dowry," she said. I could not understand why father was so happy. He looked at me. "And what do you say, Rahel?" he asked. The question troubled me suddenly. Somehow I had never quite realised that this question would really be put to me and that I would have to answer it. I rose from the table but could find nothing to say. "Well," father said in an easy tone, as if he were quite sure of the outcome, "there is plenty of time. Think it over. Take until to morrow night and decide." My mind was in a tumult. In the meantime the matchmaker practically lived in our house. He came in during the morning, he came in the afternoon, and again at night when father was home. He would sit for hours singing the young man's praise, his wealth, his business abilities, and his character. And soon he succeeded in making my parents feel that this was one chance in a lifetime. When next father asked me, "Well, what do you say?" I trembled. "I have not decided yet," I told him quietly. He was patient, but he did not look so at ease as the night before, nor so sure. "Do you want to see him again?" he asked. I said, "No." He thought for a moment. "I don't see what you want," he said. "He is a nice, quiet young man, and the main thing, he is not a wage earner. The smallest business man is worth 10 working men. Tell me definitely to morrow night. We cannot keep the people waiting for an answer any longer. This is not child's play, you know." When father was out of hearing, mother added sadly, by way of help, perhaps, "It is true that you are young, but you see, father is poor and you are not strong." I went into the bedroom and wept with my face buried in the pillows. Why did I have to decide this? I had never been allowed to decide the smallest thing before. The shape of my shoes, the length of my dress. The next evening I could not bear to face father. I saw that I must answer him definitely, and I did not know what to answer. When it grew dark, it occurred to me to go out into the street. I could always think more clearly in the air and while walking. It was a mild, clear night and there was a half moon. I walked so I could see it ahead of me. It calmed me to watch it and soon my brain did clear a little and I was able to realize something of my situation. Father is poor and I am not strong. These words had impressed themselves on my mind and now I caught at them. It is clear then, I thought, that I must marry. And if I did not marry this young man, whom could I marry? A tailor? At the thought of a tailor the young man rose in my estimation. I also saw an advantage in that he was a grocer. My people could live near and get things at cost price, bread, butter, sugar, potatoes. It will be a great help. But on the other hand, I could not picture myself living with the strange young man and his mother. I knew now that he had a mother. She was blind. He was her only son and she would live with him then as now. It struck me how similar my fate was to my mother's. She too had married an only son and his mother had been blind. And now I recalled many tragic incidents in my mother's early life. Grandmother had loved her son passionately and was often so jealous that though she had been a kind and extremely pious woman, she did not scruple to talk to her son against his wife and influence him to unkind actions and speech. Mother would weep and rebel. "I'll never talk to her again," I would hear her say. But soon she would remember grandmother's affliction and she would forgive her. Would this mother, too, talk to her son against me? I realized that I was neither so good nor so patient as my mother. I would not stand it, I thought. I would run away. But if I did not marry this young man, what then? Again I saw our dimly lit home, father cross and irritable, mother sorrowful, always the same with no change and no hope. And now it would be worse. For father would feel that I had had a chance to better things and did not do so. But is that all there is in looking forward to marriage? An uneasy fear, and what is love? When I reached home supper was already half over. I sat down at the foot of the table and mother gave me my soup. The children seemed to be sitting at the table more mannerly than usual, and father spoke quietly of trivial things in the shop. He scarcely seemed to notice me. He was always afraid of making us children feel too important. But I knew that there was one thought only in every mind. My heart beat as if it would burst. I leaned against the table and sat looking into my plate and stirring my soup, for I knew I could not lift my hand. At last I heard father lay down his spoon and push his chair away from the table a little. "Well," he asked in a by the way tone, "what have you decided?" It grew so still, even the breathing seemed to have stopped. And in this stillness I heard myself say, "Yes." I did not look up. I knew that every face had grown brighter. It was pleasant to know that I was the cause. I had been nothing but a sorrow so long. End of chapter 44. End of part 3. Part 4. Chapters 45 and 46 of Out of the Shadow by Rose Gollup Cohen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. And now a new life began for us, and for the second time I became an important person. The children fairly strutted about and boasted about their "oldest sister." And father talked to the members of his society of the coming engagement. How happy his face looked and how cheerfully he spoke. To him this was the beginning of a new life. He had scarcely ever known what it meant to be free from anxiety. First, from early childhood, it was the fear of the army where he would be compelled to violate the laws against God, "Thou shalt not kill," and the fear for the blind and helpless mother he would have to leave behind. In this fear he grew up to manhood. And then with blood money, borrowed and saved on bread and his mother's tears, he bought a false name. Then his life was in constant fear of human beings, often in fear of his own shadow. Then being found out, and all seeming lost, his escape to America, then the struggle of a stranger in a strange land, which led to only a hand-to-mouth existence, without any change, without hope of change. But now, he felt, at last things began to look bright. One child was already grown up. He was branching out, he was to be allied with a fine respectable family, with men of business. Now on a Saturday afternoon after his nap, he would not have to walk in the street aimlessly, he would go to visit his son-in-law. He would sit at a comfortable table, drink tea and talk business. His opinion of business men was high. It was his dream some day to lay down his needle and thread and perhaps open a little candy store or a soda water stand. But up to this time it had been no more than a dream. For when could he hope to put away $50 or $75? Now, however, with the prospect of having a son-in-law in business, the dream looked nearer reality. And so he beamed at Mother and teased her. "Hannah, you are going to have a son-in-law soon." Mother, too, looked happy, but I did not find it so easy to understand her. Her manner to me reminded me of the time, 4 years before, when the ticket came for me to go to America. Her eyes followed me about as they did then. Often while she sat in a corner over some work I saw from the expression of her face and the occasional motions of her head and lips that she was arguing something out with herself, as was her habit, looking at it from every possible point of view. Often, too, her eyes were on my face in dumb inquiry. And at present, I found it easier to understand every one in my family than myself. My people were happy, home was cheerful, I received some new clothes. The choice was left entirely to me for the first time in my life. And I chose what I liked. Pretty material for a dress, and it was given away to a dressmaker to be made. I chose a pretty pair of shoes and saw that they were the right size. And when I put them on they looked so small and dainty after the others and fitted so snugly that when I walked I felt as if my feet scarcely touched the ground. And yet deep down in my heart I felt so troubled. Why? I could not have told. So passed the first week after I said that little word, "Yes." Saturday the young man came. I still thought of him as "the young man," and we went out to buy an engagement ring. We went to a jeweler he knew. I stood at the glass case and watched him try one little diamond ring after another on my finger. To my surprise, the pleasure I felt in receiving the diamond ring was not as great as I had expected. He asked me to choose and I chose a very small stone in a simple setting. The ring was bought and left to be made smaller. and now I would have been glad to go home alone. But when we came outside he asked me to come and visit some of his relatives. I realized suddenly that I had duties now, new duties. In the meantime he entreated, "Please come. I have promised my youngest uncle. They expect us." So I went. This uncle had recently married. I found him a very agreeable man, and his wife charming. She took me at once under her protection. Soon more relatives arrived and she introduced me as Israel's bride. Some of the women exclaimed openly at my youthful appearance, and the men slapped Israel on the back and winked at him. His face was flushed with pleasure. Soon we sat down at a feast of fruit, cake and tea. And as the relatives sat, peeling their apples or oranges, they became curious to know whether Israel's bride had any accomplishments. "Can you sing?" they asked me. I said, "A little," and I sang. When it grew dark and I went to get my hat and coat, the young aunt followed me into the bedroom. She took my face between her hands and looked into my eyes. "It is so strange," she said, "to hear a little thing like you singing these sad songs." Directly the next day my parents began to prepare for the engagement which was to be on the coming Saturday night. A great crowd was expected. Aunt Masha managed to procure the use of an empty loft in the new shops on Jefferson Street through the janitor whose daughter was her friend. And to this loft, with parcels and bundles, many excursions were made during the week by mother and the children or father, when he came home from work at night. No one looked so happy and excited as father. He invited all the members of the society and their wives and children, and mother invited half of Cherry Street. Every one must come and participate in their happiness. No one must be overlooked or offended. Aunt Masha invited all her friends. Aunt Masha was not the rosy cheeked girl she had been. But she looked contented. She listened and advised girls in their love affairs, and took part at engagements and weddings with an elderly aunt air. We all felt that she had settled herself down to a single life. But there were times when she would not talk to us and she looked morbid and cried for days and days. Her friends were 4 mature girls. They often came to our house for me to dress their hair, for which I seemed to have a knack. They praised me for it, but otherwise they never took any notice of me. Now, however, they looked at me curiously, and as I had once been envied for going to America, I was envied now because I was going to be married. Not one of the girls had their families in this country, or a comfortable home. One spoke to me openly. She had been a pretty blonde girl when I came to this country, but now her face had no color and she stooped as she walked. "You are very fortunate, Rahel," she said. "I am tired of the shop. I want something more than a folding cot for my home." And she sighed and walked away from me with her shoulders drooping more than ever. When Saturday came there was a great deal of excitement in our house. All the children had their heads washed and sister curled their hair and helped mother get dressed. The smallest boy, 6 years old now, sat crying with a swollen cheek and had to be comforted with sweets. And I walked about from room to room and was of no help to any one. As soon as it grew dark, Aunt Masha and the girls came, and carried me off to a hairdresser, and as usual now, I who had always been last, everywhere, was first. I sat down in the chair and my friends stood about me. My hair was carefully brushed, braided, and wound all about my head and sprinkled with gold tinsel. When I came home and put on my first long dress, and looked into the mirror I saw that I looked at least 18 years old. And then it occurred to me that this was my day. That perhaps I'd never have another such day, and the desire came to be happy this one night. I went to the hall early, for indeed the loft looked like a hall now. It was bright with lights, and there were 2 long tables laden with fruits and candies, prettily arranged in glass bowls and decorated with fringed red, white and blue papers and fancy paper napkins. Folding chairs stood along the walls, and the floor was sprinkled with candle scraping for the dancing. And when the people began to arrive, I saw that this was indeed my day. No one looked upon me as a child. Every one was kind and attentive. Even the elderly people came up to shake hands with me. The blood began to beat rapidly in my veins and my heart throbbed with excitement. After the formal ceremony, when the plate was broken, and Israel slipped the little diamond ring on my finger, I refused to sit down next to him at the head of the table. I felt as if intoxicated. Instead, I walked about, talked with the girls, and flirted with the young men. Then I danced. I danced with the men, I danced with the girls, I danced until both families were alarmed and begged me to stop. I assured my mother in a whisper that I never felt in better health in my life, and continued to dance. I saw that Israel was not looking very happy. He was sitting in a corner looking neglected. It meant nothing to me. Once when I stopped for a few moments he came over and begged me to sit down. At the same time 2 young men came sliding up and asked me to dance. The 2 stood disputing and jesting. Each one claimed that he had been first. In the meantime a waltz began, a 3rd young man was passing and I took his arm and went off laughing. But as the evening advanced I grew more and more tired, and at last I felt quite limp. The guests were gone, Israel and his family were also gone, and the janitor turned out the lights on a room hazy with cigarette smoke and tables covered with fruit skins and crumpled paper napkins. We went out into the still, cold morning. I fell a little behind my people who were discussing the success of the party and walked wearily, listening to the sound of my own footsteps and wondering, "And what will be to morrow?" CHAPTER XLVI. About the middle of the week a message came from Israel's mother inviting me to come and spend a day and a night with them. I looked at mother. I had not yet gotten over the effects of the engagement night. I felt worn and looked paler than usual. But she asked me, "Will you wear your new dress?" So I knew that I was to go. The minute it was decided I was stirred with curiosity about Israel's home and his mother, whom I had not yet seen, for she had not been to the engagement. Because she was blind I was expected to find her looking like grandmother, tall and frail, and with sweet pale face and hands. But soon I found that she was not at all like that. I found Israel in the store. He looked so pleased to see me and at once led me to the door in the back of the store, and as he pushed it open I saw in the middle of the kitchen, and right under the gas which was lit, a large, strong looking woman in a brown dress and wig. "Mother! Here is Ruth," he said. His voice was full of excitement, and she put out her hands and took mine. So we stood for a long minute. The light was on her face, and I could see it working with emotion, and there was a look in it that I had often seen in grandmother's face when she wanted very much to see. After a little while, Israel took my hat and coat, and the mother walked straight to the table and drew out a chair for me. It was a surprise to me to watch her quick, sure step. She sat near me and talked all afternoon. Her voice was strong, deep, and monotonous, and as she talked almost without a stop, it was like listening to a machine grinding steadily. She told me all about her brothers, Israel's uncles, their honesty and ability in business, and of their happy lives at home. She seemed to talk with a view to entertaining me. But I also felt that she wanted me to know the kind of a family I was coming into. Then she talked about Israel. She said that he was a good, dutiful son. I believed it. I could see from his manner, from the way he looked at her, and from the way he listened to her, for when there were no customers in the store he too came and listened, that he was good to his mother. I gave her all my attention, but when I grew tired I looked about. So this is where I'm going to live, I thought. This room, which was a kitchen, dining room and bedroom in one, was all I could see. But I also noticed a closed door right opposite the one leading into the store, and a little dark window with iron bars high up near the ceiling in the wall on the right. This was the only window in the room, and it looked into the dark hall of the tenement. On the little window sill I noticed 2 books, and I promised myself to see soon what they were. Gradually, from talking about the uncles and her son, the mother led to the marriage. "You see," she said, with a wave of her large, brown, strong hands, "I have everything that is necessary in a household. There will be no need to buy a thing." My heart sank when I heard this. I had dreamed of a new, bright home. "And this is not all," the mother continued. "There is another room. Come, I'll show you." She rose and opened the door I had noticed. There was a current of chill, stale air, and I followed her into a room where there was dim daylight. "When we moved in here," the mother kept on talking, "we did not bother fixing up." I could see that. All the furniture stood in the middle of the room. There was a couch, a bureau, some chairs and an ice box, and against one wall the pieces of a white iron bed. Everything was grey, with dust and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. The 2 windows were long, narrow, and barred with iron. It looked to me like a prison. I shivered and went to the door. "Are you going in?" the mother asked. I said, "Yes, I am so cold." I could not keep my teeth from chattering. I could not picture the room except with the dust, the cobwebs and the iron barred windows, and the mother's deep monotonous voice as an accompaniment. During the evening business was at a lull in the store, so Israel was more in the house. He stood near the stove with his hands spread out for the warmth, and with a smile watched his mother moving about the room performing little duties here and there, and still relating the merits of her relatives. He often glanced at me. He looked as if he too had something that he wanted to say. But he also looked as if it could wait, there was no need for hurry. We had not yet spoken since I had come. But I noticed, or, more correctly, felt that his manner toward me was different from what it had been before the engagement. It was more intimate, though we had not seen each other since, nor did we know each other any better. I felt uncomfortable. At last, when there was a pause in the mother's talk, I asked Israel, "Do you read sometimes?" "Yes," he said slowly, "when I have nothing better to do." "What are those 2 books? May I see them?" He stood up on a chair to reach them, blew the dust from them, and gave them to me. Then he too sat down at the table and watched me turn the pages. I felt happier now, and having the books to which to give my attention, I felt more at ease. The first book turned out to be one I had already read. I was delighted. It was like meeting a friend. And the thought that Israel had the same book was a sort of link and made me feel more friendly toward him. So far we seemed to have had nothing in common, nothing to talk about. But now there was the book. I glanced at the pages here and there and asked enthusiastically what he thought of this or that part, and how he liked this or that character. He was still smiling, but he merely answered yes or no to my questions. The second book was a translation from the Russian into Yiddish, partly letters, partly diary. I looked it through and was at once filled with a burning desire to read it. The intimate tone of the first person in which it was written made me feel as if that someone were actually talking to me. I could feel his presence. "Shall I read it aloud?" I asked Israel. "No," he said without any interest. "What is the use?" He even looked as if he would have liked me to put the book away. But the only time I put a book away at home was when I was forced to. And here I knew no one would even hint that I put it away, so I took my advantage and read. But the thought that I was rude and that the boy felt hurt perhaps made me feel uncomfortable. So every now and then I would look up, say a word, or smile at him. I could smile now. I felt so happy when I read. In this way the evening and the next morning passed. Late in the afternoon, Israel hastened in from the store looking excited. "Ruth," he said eagerly, "will you come into the store for a minute? I want to introduce you to a customer of ours." I rose from the table, scarcely knowing what I did. I was miserable in a moment. Meeting strangers was a great hardship. And this seemed so unnecessary, merely a customer of Israel's. I could say I did not want to go. But that seemed like a child. And to say that I did not like to meet strangers was also impossible. A person of that kind was thought a bore. Israel looked at me but only saw my unwillingness to go. He looked slightly annoyed and explained as if he were sorry that explanations should be necessary. "But she is our best and oldest customer, and she asked to meet you." This explanation made it still worse, though why I could not have told at the moment. His mother, too, joined him in explaining and urging. So I rose and followed him into the store. My cheeks were burning, and I dreaded the light and the stranger's eyes. At that moment Israel was more of a stranger to me than he had been a little while before. I stopped at the counter right near the door in the back. Further than that I would not go, and Israel had to call his customer to the back part. I saw a tall, dried out looking woman in black, with sharp, dark eyes that looked me over at once. Israel introduced us. She smiled, I nodded. And now my only thought was to go back into the kitchen, when I saw Israel push a slip of paper and a pencil toward me, and lift a basket of bags and bundles to the counter. "Will you put down these figures while I call them off?" he said. What was my trouble of a few minutes before compared to what I felt now? I never could add a row of figures correctly; and since I had come to this country I had scarcely even written any numbers. A sick feeling came over me with the shame that was awaiting me. I took the pencil and bent over the slip of paper and heard Israel call 10. 10, I repeated to myself, looking at the paper blindly and wondering. Which comes first, the one or the naught? Ages seemed to pass since I had heard the number called. I put down something. 17. I heard Israel's voice again. And again I wondered which came first. How the blood beat in my temples! I decided to keep all the ones on one side, to the left. 23, Israel called. And now it seemed as if I must break down. In Yiddish many people read numbers like the script, from right to left, which would read 320 although written 23. When I had been learning as a child it had been a great puzzle to me and now it bewildered me altogether. Suddenly it occurred to me that if Israel called the numbers in English, it would be easier for me, for at least some of them I could write as they sounded. He did, and it was easier. So I stumbled on from number to number. Often I felt as if I must give up, but still went on. At last I saw Israel put the last package into the basket. "Now add it," he said. This was the hardest yet. Again I did not know from which side to begin, the right or left. But I added it somehow, and then I straightened up. "It is 96 cents," I said, and stood holding the little piece of paper in my hand and looking at it. I would have given anything not to have to give it up. But Israel was holding his hand out for it, and the woman's eyes were upon me. So I laid it in his hand and stood waiting. I thought he would go over it at once and show me the mistakes right before the woman. But he did not. He just folded it and put it into the basket. I felt grateful for that. The woman said good bye. Israel took the basket on his arm and they went out. When the door closed behind them, I leaned across the counter. Nearly all the strength of my body had gone in the effort. And as I waited I thought, if Israel had known me a long, long time, would he have done this? Why did he do it at all? Was it to show the woman that he was not marrying an illiterate, or was it to keep me a little longer in the store and give his customer a chance to see me? Had he been talking to her about me, or did he wish at once to begin breaking me into the business? The bell over the door rang, and I straightened up. Israel came up smiling and said in his inoffensive way and yet with great earnestness, "There was a mistake." I opened my eyes wide in pretended surprise. "Really?" "Yes," he said mildly, but with still greater earnestness. "It was even 4 cents more." For a moment I could scarcely believe that I heard right. "Is that all I made a mistake in?" I thought. 4 cents? Then I looked at Israel, his earnestness struck me funny, and I mimicked him a little. 4 cents more. Then I laughed while he looked on puzzled. I laughed and tears were running down my cheeks. "Oh, there is hope for me," I thought. "In time I can learn to add even with 2 people looking on." Chapter 47 through 49 of Out of the Shadow by Rose Gollup Cohen. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 47. The next day was Friday, and Israel kept his store closed in the evening. He came to our house about 7 o'clock and showed us 2 little tickets which were still unfamiliar to my family and myself. "These are for the theatre," he said, "for to night." The children looked at me with bright eyes. "You will tell us all about it," they said, and mother looked quite excited as she helped me dress. I remembered Mr. Cohen's shop, and recalled what I had heard the men say about plays and actors. I thought, perhaps I'll see Jacob Adler in King Lear. We walked to the theatre in silence. Indeed, we were never anything else but silent. This was the second time I was out alone with him. The first time had been when we went to get the ring. Then I merely felt awkward while walking with him. But now I felt nervous and miserable. The silence oppressed me, and as we walked along, his sleeve, as if by design, kept coming in contact with mine, and I kept edging away, but very slowly so as not to hurt his feelings. for I was not sure if it was by design that he brushed against my sleeve. In our seats in the balcony it was the same way. He was very attentive, but chiefly with looks, and his elbow was on the arm of my seat. I pressed into the farthest corner and the edge of the arm cut into my back. I sat and could think of nothing but how to keep clear. Of the play I have a blurred picture of an angry king, dressed in scarlet and white, on a throne, and a throng of people. I knew the play was not King Lear. The walk home was again a silent one through the streets now almost deserted. I remember how glad I was when I caught sight of our tenement. I never remembered it looking so nice as it did now in the pale light of the street lamp which stood right in front of it. The hall door, as usual, stood open, and the light shone through the hall all the way to our door. I stopped in the doorway, and Israel stopped on the stoop. I felt under obligation to him. I felt that I ought to say something, but could not think what. So I said good night and turned to go when he called, "Ruth." His voice sounded so muffled. I faced about and he came and stood near me. "I want one kiss," he said. I felt panic stricken. "Oh, I couldn't," I said. "I couldn't possibly. Indeed, I couldn't." "But we are engaged now," he said in a hurt tone, as if he felt he were within his rights. Then it was, or had I been realizing it little by little all along, that it flashed through my mind what married life may mean with a person for whom one does not care. I stepped backward toward the door, repeating again and again, "I couldn't possibly. I am sorry, but I couldn't." And then I knocked. Israel said good night and walked down the steps, and mother let me into the front room lit by the tiny night lamp. "How was it?" she whispered. I whined, "I am tired." She tiptoed away meekly, and I sat down on the couch and wondered how I was to live through the night. In the morning when mother came into the front room and looked at me, she cried out, "My God, how you look! Do you feel so sick? Why did you not call me?" "I am not sick," I said. Then I broke down. I told her that I could not marry Israel. I clung to her and begged her not to blame me. She spoke tenderly and tried to quiet me. The children gathered around the couch and father came in. I expected he would upbraid me. But he was as tender as mother, who stood with her arms tight about me. "Hush, hush," he said. "If you feel so unhappy you need not marry him." "And won't I be forced?" I asked. "You won't be forced." "Can no one force me?" There were tears in his eyes. "No one can force you." Still I kept asking it over and over again and laughed and cried hysterically. My mother helped me over to her own bed in the bedroom and I tried to rest. I lay facing the door and could see all the way through the kitchen into the front room where mother and father talked in whispers and the children walked about on tiptoes. I lay wondering what father would tell Israel. He would come to day, for this was Saturday, and he kept his store closed. He came about 1:00. I saw him stop for a moment with his back against the door and stand there almost smiling. My parents greeted him about as usual but more quietly. Soon I heard mother say still more quietly, "Ruth does not feel well." He was not at the door now and I could not see his face. But I heard him ask anxiously, "Did you have a doctor? Shall I call one?" Mother answered something. All this seemed to me unnecessary conversation. Why doesn't father tell him? I wondered. Suddenly a fear came over me. Perhaps father would not tell him after all. I remembered now that he had such a way of putting off doing a thing when we children wanted it done. And the more we wanted it, the more reason he saw why it should be put off. "Wouldn't next day do, or next week? What is the hurry? We must learn to be patient and wait." So I thought that now too he might put off telling Israel. He might even think that if he let it go for a while this little storm about my not wanting to marry would soon blow over and things would be as usual. I was in despair again. What shall I do? I wondered. Then it occurred to me to take the thing into my own hands. I was sorry I was not dressed, but I could not stop to do it now. Not 10 minutes longer could I bear to be engaged. I called to mother and asked her to tell Israel that I wanted to talk to him. Mother went slowly back to the front room. As he was coming in, I could not see his face very distinctly, for the light was at his back. But I could see that it looked anxious and was sorry, knowing that I would soon hurt him. He came and leaned up against the doorpost. He asked me too whether he should call a doctor. I answered something and then I was silent. I did not know where to begin or what to say. Suddenly I burst out that I did not want to get married and wept bitterly with my head in the pillow. I said I was sorry for the unpleasantness and the trouble, but I would not get married. I would never marry at all. "But why?" he asked finally. His voice sounded as if he did not take me seriously. A moment before I had decided not to tell him, to spare him the hurt. Now when I saw he did not take me seriously there was only one thought in my mind, to be free of the engagement. So I said, "Because I do not love you." "Oh," he said, in a matter of course tone, "you will love me after we are married." And then he gave me many instances of his uncles and aunts and his mother. I was in despair. How could I impress it upon him that for me this thing was impossible? And then it flashed through my mind how I could make him see it in the moment. I sat up, and in my eagerness I stretched out my hand and laid it on his sleeve, and he came a step nearer. "Listen," I said, "you wanted to kiss me last night." I could see that he felt a little guilty. "That was all right," I said. "I can imagine that if I loved you it would have made me happy, but as it is, the very thought of it drives me mad." Even in that light I could see that his face changed colour, and he stepped back and leaned heavily against the door. As I saw him weaken I quickly followed up my advantage. I took the little ring from under the pillow and pressed it into his hand. "Now go," I begged him. "I am so sorry, but please go, go." And he went, and I sat and watched him. His step was unsteady and his back more bent than usual. He looked like a little old man. CHAPTER XLVIII. That night a message came from Israel's mother. She said, "I pray that you may have 1,000 bridegrooms, but not one shall you marry. I wish you no other ill but this." Mother cried bitterly, and father, who had been so quiet, so silent all afternoon, went out into the street, still without saying a word. Only now I really believed that the engagement was off. And now all my troubles seemed small. I rose and dressed in my old clothes. I did not think they looked so shabby and faded, nor were the shoes so clumsy and large. I was not sorry for what had happened. I was never sorry for any experience I had had. At the time, when it was hard, I could not help grumbling, but later I was even glad. This thing I knew. I went to mother and tried to comfort her. I crept up to her, mouse fashion. We all loved fondling, but we were not used to showing it. Mother looked at me sideways and said, "Go away, mouse." But I saw the shadow of a smile in one corner of her mouth, so I pressed closer to her. "Don't cry," I said. "When you and father are old and the children are all married, you will be glad to have some one left at home." Later that night, when the children gathered around the lamp on the table to do their lessons for Monday, I too sat down among them, and as I watched them write I suddenly remembered the diary I had read in Israel's home. I took a sheet of paper and a pencil and wrote a few words, in Yiddish of course. Then I crossed them out and wrote again, trying to improve them. So I kept rubbing and crossing out. But finally, when I was at the bottom of the page, a sentence stood clear which I translate now. "I feel new joy in life and in freedom." I often attempted to write about what I felt or thought or saw. Most of the time after I wrote a sentence and the meaning was not clear at once, I grew despondent and tore it up. But sometimes I was patient and determined like tonight, and when I succeeded I felt extremely happy and kept the bit of paper. I kept what I wrote that night, and a few days later I copied it into a little penny notebook. I was determined that I too would write a diary, though I did not clearly know what a diary was. When next I wrote in the little book I had already been working 2 weeks. The shop in which I found myself now was a piecework shop, not of the better kind. The work was cheap, the prices low, and the men scarcely lifted their head except to crack jokes. Oh, those jokes! I was older now and it was harder to sit among the men and listen. I translate what follows, the first sentence in the little book. "I hate the shop. I feel sick. I feel tired. I cannot see any meaning in life." This time I made a great effort to keep at work, and I kept up as long as I was able to walk to the shop. Then again I lay on my back on the couch, and now it was as usual in our house. But now I did not care. I did not care about anything. All I wanted was to be left lying still. There were days when I scarcely felt any life, when I could not feel the couch under me. My body seemed to be suspended in the air, and millions of specks of brown dust danced before me. One day as I lay so, I felt a touch on my wrist. This touch had become familiar since I had been ill. It was a doctor's touch. I opened my eyes and saw a woman, a stranger, sitting beside the couch. Neither in looks nor in dress had I ever seen any one like her in our neighbourhood. She was also beautiful and distinguished. "How do you feel?" she asked me. Her lips smiled but her eyes remained almost sad. She spoke to mother in German, gave her a card and went away. I spelled out the printed name on the card, Lillian D. Wald, 265 Henry Street. Again I translate from the little book, though it was a long, long while before I wrote what follows. Miss Wald comes to our house and a new world opens for us. We recommend to her all our neighbors who are in need. The children join clubs in the nurses' settlement and I spend a great deal of time there. Miss Wald and Miss Brewster treat me with affectionate kindness. I am being fed up. I am to be sent to the country for health, for education. The morning before I was to start Miss Wald herself went with me to get me a hat. We did not go to a millinery shop, but what I now think must have been a sort of a class in the little Henry Street school. She asked for a hat that would stay well on my head in all kinds of weather. In the afternoon I washed all my clothing. How I worked! Mother said I looked like the old Raoul. I went to bed and made her promise to call me early. But when she stood at the couch in the morning it was as though through a mist that I saw her face. Later in the day I saw even more indistinctly. First I saw Miss Wald moving about the room, then Miss Brewster. On the table there was a red flower in a glass of water and a little white unfamiliar bowl. Mother saw me looking at it and brought it to me. "You see," she said, trying to interest me, "it is jelly, and when you feel better you can have some." Still later the Settlement doctor sat at the couch and mother was weeping bitterly. In a week I felt well enough to go about again. But now the doctor and Miss Wald thought I had better go to the hospital first and get quite strong. And so it was that I missed the opportunity of the education, for it never came again. XLIX. It was not an easy thing for my people to send me to the hospital. For the very word filled us with fear. How could a helpless sick person be trusted to strangers? Besides, it was quite understood that in the hospital patients were practiced upon by hardened medical students and then neglected. Whenever we saw any one miserable, dirty, neglected, we would say, "He looks like a heg dish." Hospital. And so we saw our neighbors all about us borrow and pawn but keep their sick at home. And when once in a while we saw a person taken to the hospital we looked after him mournfully as if he were already carried to the burial grounds. It was also an open acknowledgment of the direst poverty. And so Miss Wald had a great deal of reasoning and persuading to do and my parents had a great deal to overcome to consent. Late one afternoon then, with a change of clothing and a little bundle under my arm and a letter from Miss Wald in my hand, I started out for the part of the city we called uptown, as strange to me as if it were in a different country. And now a great experience was to be mine. Never again could I look upon the life I was leaving in the same way, for I was to have a glimpse into a different world. As I rode along in the Grand Street and Third Avenue surface cars, I asked this one and that one about my destination, and was glad to hear that people knew about the place. I felt a little scared, I did not know what I would find. At last I stood before the building of the Presbyterian Hospital and then before the clerk's desk. "Your name and address?" he asked. I gave it. "Can your father pay?" I had never yet been confronted by this question and my face burned. After a moment I had to admit that he could not. "What does your father do?" "A tailor." "How much does he earn?" $8, sometimes 10. "How many are there in the family?" 6 beside myself." "Take a seat, please." Soon a man came in, and I followed him through wide halls where our footsteps echoed. We went up in an elevator, and I was taken into an immense room with 2 rows of white beds, and in each bed a pale face. Then I saw a nurse, like the nurses in the Settlement, and I felt reassured at once. She led me to a chair at an empty bed, put 2 screens about me, said hurriedly and without looking at me, "Undress, please," and went away. I felt bewildered. She could not have meant that, I thought, and I sat still. At home the only time we went to bed was when we could not stand on our feet. But I was well now. I also realized that the nurse would come and go as she pleased and there was nothing but a screen between myself and all those faces that I saw in the beds. The more I thought over it, the more impossible it seemed that I had caught the right English words. But what did she mean? I sat and blamed myself for not having been more attentive. The English spoken here and by the nurses in the settlement was so different from the Yiddish English that I knew. But I soon forgot all about it as I looked around at the snow white bed beside me and at the little table with a glass top and at the screens forming the walls of a small room. And I thought with joy, "This is going to be my room and these are my things." Over the bed there was also a large window which I claimed at once. The light from the setting sun was streaming in and the muslin walls of the tiny room were colored rose. I was looking about me and out of the window and reality was slipping further and further away. Presently I saw as in a dream a small round-toed boot push one side of the screen away a very little, and the nurse came in carrying a small tub of water. And when she saw me sitting there just as she had left me, she put down the tub on the table, placed her hands on her hips and looked at me and sighed. And her eyes said very plainly, "Well, what kind of a being is this anyway?" Half an hour later I lay flat on my back and my wet hair was spread out on a towel over the pillow. When the screen was taken away I saw that mine was the last bed in a row of 10, facing 10 other beds. A few days later, when the clock struck 2, visitors began to come in. I saw that they were all Gentiles and mostly Americans. All the women wore hats. They came in quietly and their faces looked calm. I sat up and watched the door. I scarcely dared to hope that my mother would come, that she would be able to get away, but she did. She stopped in the doorway and looked eagerly from bed to bed. Her face was flushed and she wore her little shawl on her head. When she saw me she almost ran over the highly polished floor and I was afraid she would fall. All the people stared at her and then at both of us when she sat on my bed. Her face was covered with perspiration. If I had had difficulty in finding my way to the hospital, what must the trip have been for her who could neither speak nor understand a word of English? I had wonderful things to tell her, and much she could see for herself, about the cleanliness and the care patients received and about the food which I thought fit for holidays, though I could not at once like it for our foods are more highly seasoned. The meat and juice which the doctor ordered I had not touched because it was treif, meaning that the cattle had not been killed in accordance with the Jewish law. But mother told me that I must eat everything and get strong. "You are not here for pleasure," she said. "Take it as you would medicine." And so it was that I now had to break the vow I had made to myself when I came to this country, not to eat treif meat. Mother went away happy and reassured, and I remained still happier than she. Chapter 49